Hi, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're joining us from today. We'll just give everyone a moment. I just see people are starting to come in, which is great. I just wanted to say welcome to our first in a new series here at Guidebook, which is our Guidebook Meets. This is all about, speaking with Guidebook users, understanding how they are utilizing the Guidebook app and giving you as well the opportunity to ask questions. We really want to hear from the audience today, so do please utilize the Q&A component. And we're going to have a nice conversation. I'm Nathan. I'm the events and community manager here at Guidebook. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by Casey Ford, the interim director of student transitions for student leadership and engagement at Clemson University. So welcome, Casey.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
As I mentioned, today is really about getting an understanding into Clemson University. And I always like to start at the beginning and really understand the why and what was going on during the kind of decision-making process few years ago when Clemson decided that they needed a different solution to really explore utilizing Guidebooks. So yeah, tell us a little bit about what brought you to the platform and what you were trying to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. So some quick context I think that could be helpful for folks understanding kind of the way that we use it and what our roles sort of require from Guidebook. As Nathan mentioned, I'm the interim director of student transitions, which for us refers to anything considered a transition program. So new student and family orientation sessions that take place primarily throughout the summer. Our family weekend events that happen in the fall and spring semesters for our students and their families, and then our welcome week, which sort of integrates students to campus, typically the first week before classes in mid-August. For us, that's a lot of event planning and a lot of schedules and a lot of information to communicate that can change often, which I think was the biggest catalyst in making the switch over to Guidebook. So I've been in this role or an iteration of it for about 3 years now. We've used Guidebook the entire time that I've been here, but prior to that, for staff members who were in these seats and in this office earlier on than that, they typically relied on printed paper schedules, right? So when families and students arrived for an orientation session, for example, they were able to check in and be handed this beautifully crafted paper schedule that walked them through the events of that day. We had some similar publications for our family weekend programming as well. The pro of those, of course, is that they look awesome and they give folks a really good glimpse into what their experience will be, and kind of serve as a little takeaway for them. The con is that, and what we found is that the information in those publications was often out of date immediately by the time we had it printed. So when students would arrive for events and we handed them the schedule, maybe we had a parking location change. Maybe we had some sessions that had to be moved to different times, anything of that sort. What we were handing them was no longer, really an accurate guide to what they were about to experience. And so the biggest piece, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but the biggest piece in the pro of Guidebook is that it enabled us to still craft something that was really complete and still craft something that was comprehensive in terms of an event schedule and resources and communication, but also it could be updated like that. So if we did have a switch or something that needed to be communicated, really quickly, that we were able to do that and not waste so much paper as well.
Amazing. Yeah. I think the paper piece is great on many fronts, not only wasting a lot of paper, and paper can become out of date quite quick, but also it's a very costly process, printing a lot of flyers and handouts and schedules. How did the team kind of dynamic, a lot of people work on organizing the events, how did the team kind of come together in terms of who's going to be responsible for the app? How did you think about that collaboration process? And ultimately, did it change the way in which dynamic of the team worked in the build up to an event?
Sure. So I think what is helpful is, so we aren't the only users at Clemson University of Guidebook, but we do use it for a lot of our programs, and we are certainly a team and an office who relies on it pretty heavily. I think what is helpful in our structure is that orientation, for example, is this sort of collaborative, everyone on my team and I are equally focused on that initiative in the summer. And so we get into the habit of all working on that guide and all being editors. Some of the other programs that we have throughout the year, so family weekend, welcome week, pieces like that, are a little bit more tied to specific staff members. And so I think that has been helpful in kind of divvying up, anyone who works here and anyone who's on our team knows that as a part of their program planning process, we'll be updating that guidebook. And as a result, everyone gets a lot of experience in how to do that. So I think by the time we get to the summer, for example, where we are at our busiest season, we're moving as quickly as we ever do, and we are having to make a lot of those changes really quickly in order for them to be accurate, sometimes the next day, sometimes in the moment. It's helpful to have at least 3 people, sometimes student assistants, sometimes a team of even more people who they have that competency. They've worked on it all year. They understand, they've been trained by our guidebook folks, and they kind of understand what needs to happen so that if the person taking lead, for example, on an event has a change or receives information that needs to be reflected in a guidebook, it can be as easy as that person asking someone else to do that as they're talking. And we can get that messaging out to folks, specifically families and students, truly in a matter of seconds. So I think it's sort of fostered our collaboration. I think we certainly work that way already. That's kind of our natural go-to. But I think having this central tool that all of us rely on and all of us know how to utilize has supported that as well.
Absolutely. And did you kind of, I guess one of the challenges is like duplication and trying to avoid, people doing 2 tasks once. Did you kind of see any challenges? Are you still facing any challenges as teams? I know you've just had family weekend, which I know was a great success, but yeah, do you kind of face any of those challenges when multiple people are kind of utilizing an app and utilizing technology generally?
Yeah, I think that can certainly happen. I think that all of us knowing that that's something that has to be checked off and all of us knowing that that's a part of the process can sometimes lend itself to folks assuming that someone else is doing it, or the opposite, where it's kind of on all of our radars. And so we'll go in at some point and kind of realize, oh, we all thought we changed that one piece, but maybe we didn't quite do that. So I think that has been a bit of a learning process for us. Certainly helpful when we have some of our more focus events, right? So I tend to take the lead on our family programming. And so it's easier for that to kind of stay in my radar or my wheelhouse, and then have coworkers go through and verify, just be another set of eyes. But then I think we've learned a lot, specifically in the last 3 years, since we've sort of brought back in-person on-campus orientation programming. We've learned kind of what system works best in terms of maybe whose role that is for that moment, and whose role is kind of the editor or the scroller through. Let me take on the role of a parent who's never looked at this app before. Is this making sense? Is this really communicating what we think it's communicating? So it's been an interesting process to learn what makes sense.
Definitely. I think that process you touched on there is, thinking about end users. I mean, you have kind of very different categories of end users, whether that's families, whether that's obviously the students themselves. How do you kind of approach that process in a little bit more detail in terms of, getting them engaged is a very different journey, getting them on, interesting to kind of understand if they use the app differently and what kind of areas of the app are more beneficial depending on who the end user is that you're focusing on?
Sure. I very often, I think, take on the perspective of a parent or a family member of a college student. That's sort of the group that I spend the most time thinking about and thinking through how to support in my role. And I think it's certainly fair to say that pushing out to that group, particularly before they've even come to campus, hey, we really need you to rely on this mobile app, is not always a message that comes across the same way that it does to college students, right? I think we've tried to show the benefit of that and show the kind of payoff of having folks commit to that by showing all that it can do. So one way that we sort of approached that challenge in the past is we had a member of our Clemson Family Ambassador Board, so a group of current parents who volunteer at these events and kind of speak to incoming parents as folks who have been in their shoes. We had a member of that group film a tutorial of her using the app. And so we were able to hear her kind of voice over the features that it had. We had footage of her, scrolling through the app, clicking on what events were tracked per guest, clicking on resources, showing folks exactly how to add something to their schedule. And we have that video playing in the morning of each orientation session. And then it's also something that we send out ahead of time to those groups. So I think trying to get as many visual representations as we can out to those groups, specifically our supporters, and kind of demonstrate, why we think this is a helpful tool for them, has helped us get a little bit more buy-in, I think, by the time that they get to campus. And then, of course, we're also able to say to them and their students, hey, this is something that you're going to use multiple more times. It will be your guide for this orientation session here on campus, but then it will be your guide for welcome week, for family weekend, in the spring. It's going to be something that you rely on to really understand how to navigate events on campus. And so I think trying to appeal to that group, to all groups, by having someone who might be a little bit more relatable and a little bit more closer to their perspective, kind of join us in pitching that has been helpful.
Absolutely. And do you find that, because I think Clemson have done a really good job on, you have the branded app option. You've done a really good job in how you kind of bring everything together in one space. And do going back to, I guess, when the decision was made, is that kind of one of the reasons the branded app was important? Because you're going to have people coming back to this multiple times, and that kind of continuity is important. Yeah. How do you find the branded app works for you at Clemson?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's the CU Events app for us. And it's something that we push anytime we have the chance. I think it is helpful that, again, we're not the only users. So a lot of folks in, student specific academic colleges will take advantage of that app. Plenty of other entities on campus have kind of joined in there as well. And so it really is, that's helpful because it's a true statement for us to be able to tell them, as folks who are often the first people on campus that they're meeting, that they will continue to use that. Yeah, I think there's on a college campus, there's 17 apps and portals and resources that we push for people. And, on the one hand, I think we should balance trying to be aware of that and trying to not go total information overload. And I think the alternative to that could be an even more siloed, separated, you've got to keep up with all of these, paper documents, or even all of these websites that sort of don't do a great job of combating that either. And so I think being able to show this branded app that we can say is going to be helpful for your entire time here at Clemson, and being able to bring campus partners into that fold as well, kind of supports that message.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's a really good way to kind of demonstrate it. Coming back to, the multiple use cases and events that you have throughout the calendar, do you see, do you build the app differently depending on orientation, welcome week, family weekend? And how does that impact your metrics? Like, do you go back and look at how different apps are engaged with, obviously the volume of people that are downloading, utilizing different components of the app? Is one better than the other? Like, where do you kind of see those metrics, and do you analyze them and allow that to kind of help with planning going forward?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think so. I think one place where we certainly have room to improve and room to make some more informed decisions is our guidebook metrics. That's not something that we think about as much as we, I think, draw our own conclusions probably. I do think that something that is helpful for us, kind of going back to the multiple portals and apps and tools that we're pushing to folks, is trying to merge those a little bit. So we use a different platform, for example, as our communication hub to all parents and families. We use that to manage our event registration, some other pieces. But we use Guidebook as almost our primary website for all of that information and for all of the content. So if we're posting about family weekend registration or the family weekend schedule or family calendar, that's a resource. If we're publicizing any of that information, we're putting it on the Guidebook site. And so what we can do is go into what we call our Clemson Parent and Family Experience portal. And when we send communications through there, we're linking that Guidebook site 7 different times in a message. And so the idea being that if I can see that, 50,000 families have opened the email that we just sent through the portal and they're consuming that information, I can assume that they're also then clicking that Guidebook link, and making sure that they're kind of taking time to peruse on that platform before they get to campus.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good time. I always, want to showcase some of the work that you do at Clemson. I've picked your last and most recent event, your family weekend, and I think I've just got a couple of minutes demo, and I'm happy to kind of comment a little bit. And if you want to, sort of comment on some of the procedures you have when building it. But I think it's just a nice way to not only see the app itself, but the branding and that continuity that gives. But I like it. I mean, I've been in the Clemson app. You get a sense of your colors, your brand. I always think that, the schedule is an important piece, as you can see here. Adding, allowing people to create their own schedules, and if you need to set reminders is great. I think one thing that you've done well in here, which we'll get to, this is a pre-recorded demo. So I think, here, there's a lot of information that you need to kind of share across these events. And it's a really kind of clean way in which you can really get that across. I think here, utilizing this, I think campuses are big. They're spread across a lot of components of an area. And I think the way that you're building in different PDF maps to showcase some of this stuff is really nice as well. And I think if anyone who is using Guidebook or hasn't seen Guidebook before as well, if you have any questions and you want to put them in the chat as you're kind of visualizing how Casey is using some of this stuff, please do. Or if you're using another app and you see something that's interesting, we absolutely want to hear from the audience as well today. But you're portraying a lot of information in here, which I think is great. And I think the good thing is, it's not just you can bring this in. This is a PDF. You can bring in web links, which I see that you've done really well through some of your apps to share information a lot easier, making the build out a little bit easier as well. I think this is linking to your website.
Yep.
How long, Casey, does it take you to kind of build an app like this, and how many people really were involved for this particular one?
Sure. So what's helpful is that we're typically able to clone and hang on to a good bit of kind of the base content, right? We have some sort of signature events and some university kind of messaging that for the most part stays the same. And so if we're able to keep, at least a good chunk of the content of one family weekend guide, for example, and then update what we need to for the next and kind of rebrand that way, that's helpful. I think building all of that from the ground up, probably the first time that we did, definitely a couple of weeks. I think that process has certainly become easier as, again, all of us have gotten used to it and kind of learned the ins and outs of how to add that information and do so pretty efficiently. Yeah, I think between a couple of us, probably 2 to 3 weeks. And then of course we get to a point where we're maybe a week or two out from an actual event and we're just sort of combing through, making sure things are still up to date, things are still accurate. A lot of those pieces you showcase the family weekend map, for example, or anything that we might be sort of in production outside of what we're able to add ourselves, kind of making sure that we're able to update those pieces as well. So it's something that we try to do consistently throughout the process so that we're not sort of scrambling at the end. But I think, again, after having some of those core guides for a couple of semesters now, it's a much less daunting process than it once was.
That's good. That's what we hope. And every year, I hope it gets a bit easier and a bit faster. I know you mentioned you don't necessarily utilize the metrics within Guidebook fully in terms of how you analyze kind of post-event performance, but just generally as well at Clemson, because there's a lot of people here that might be really well accustomed to using an app, but also just thinking about those kind of key marks in the university campus calendar. Like, do you kind of have planning sessions around, what specific improvements you want to make, and maybe the app does play into that? But when you look at the family weekend that just passed, how are you thinking about family weekend next year? How are you kind of assessing, what went well, what didn't, whether technology can help or not, but how are you looking kind of to the future with some of that stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that and we're sort of in that assessment process right now, just being a couple of weeks, kind of post that event. And I think as we continue that process, a theme that we often see, whether it's something that needs improvement or something that showed marked improvement or whatever kind of that metric is. But a theme is always communication in general. How are we communicating to our families? How frequently are we communicating the same message? One of the things I talk to my team a lot about is that we spend so much time talking internally about where families should park and what the process for check-in should be and who they're going to hear from, or any number of things that I think sometimes think that it's been communicated that much to that extent to families. And really, it's just we're talking about it every day internally. And so making sure to kind of take off that hat and think through, okay, if I know absolutely nothing and I have never been to campus and I did not attend Clemson as an undergraduate student, and this is maybe my first time, what is going to make that a quality customer service experience? Guidebook is certainly a piece of that. I think, again, in terms of being able to communicate really quickly, in terms of being able to have what we need to exist on someone's screen right in front of them is always a piece of that. And so, yeah, I think as we think through family weekend of the fall, or really as we're gearing up for this summer and kind of preparing for what's to come there, I think trying to flip that perspective and think through what a particular family member or a new student or a campus partner needs to hear from us, and how Guidebook enables us to set that up is something that we're kind of always thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, it's like those challenges are constantly evolving. And is that something that you've sort of felt over the last few years? Are you sort of experiencing the way in which the events are maybe in the last couple of years versus how they were a few years ago? Have you kind of sensed that on campus? Are you kind of getting a sense of that the event is evolving and you need to kind of think about it differently in any ways at all?
Yeah, yeah. I think one piece of that is, and anyone who's joined us today who works certainly in student affairs, but also in any kind of event management field, I would imagine, has felt the difference. I think post-COVID, I think that we are at a place where a lot of that is we're getting back to some levels of engagement that we used to see, which is really exciting. And I think we're still trying to come back, and we're still trying to figure out, okay, in this, iteration of the world, what are the needs that we're trying to meet? If, for example, coming to campus in April, not long after spring break and not long before graduation is not a real need that families have, for example, does there need to be a spring family weekend? Is a conversation that my office is having. I think if there are ways to engage with folks that maybe do rely more on technology, or just look differently than I think the way that we've thought about them in the past, we need to be really okay with considering that. And so to answer your question, absolutely. I think that we're still in the process of trying to figure out what our role is in family engagement, in college student engagement, and kind of how to best meet those needs, even if that feels really different than it did 3-4 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. From my own experience in events outside of the education industry, the change has been super significant. I think the way that people engage in terms of even just like registering and committing to turning up to something, it's so much closer to the live date than it's ever been before.
Right.
People are scared to commit months in advance. Well, not scared, but they're less willing to. Um, and do you find as well from the student perspective, the way in which you're engaging with students is changing a lot in recent years? Are we all evolve and every generation is different. Do you kind of see that in the way that you engage with students and the events that you create? And how are you kind of thinking of maybe new ways or new ideas around your events to kind of think about the future student?
Yeah, I think a piece of that is what we've been saying, which is just the way that events look different. I think another piece is kind of generational to the point that you're making. Colleagues and I who are around my age kind of joke, when we were students, there was just a different approach or a different attitude maybe towards events in general, and there was a lot of value placed on just wanting an experience, right? And wanting something to be engaged with in that way with other college students, with our friends, with mentors, with whomever. And it's not that I don't think students today want that. I think they do. I just don't know that it's always their first priority when they're thinking through all the things that they have to manage. And so if they are, you know, being sort of asked to consider an involvement opportunity, a student leadership opportunity, and they're being asked to do their 20 hours of coursework and their double major to get a job after school, or to make sure that they're, on track for their internship hours, or any of these other parts of the college experience that are really, are just as important. I think sometimes we find and are still even surprised to find some of the balancing of those priorities that comes differently than maybe I did as an undergraduate student. And so I think our role is often remembering that that's not something we should take personally, first of all, and that, in our roles as folks who are supporting students, how can I support that student who wants to be successful in that way? And sometimes I think that is 100% planning an event or crafting an experience and kind of challenging them to pursue that and see where that goes. I think other times it's, considering that's maybe not their next thing. That's maybe not the answer. Is there a way to support them and kind of the circles that they're already involved in? So I don't know that answers your question, but that's something that we think about a lot for sure.
No, definitely. I think it's good perspective to have. So yeah, I think you've answered the question well there. And just kind of bringing it back around to the app, to Guidebook, and again thinking about the future and thinking about how Clemson's planning for the events that you'll run in the future. What's missing? What would you like to see different in the app? Whether that's, a feature release, whether that's something that we can do in terms of supporting you with engagement or communication. Our product team always loves feedback. So yeah, how do you feel the app could evolve to support your challenges and your needs?
Yeah. Well, Nathan knows that I'm nervous to answer this question for fear of requesting something that already exists and I don't know. But I think that the general thought that comes to my mind is finding more ways to integrate all those tools that I've mentioned. So, I talked a little bit about the communication portal that we use for families. There's some other apps and tools that are certainly pushed out to students and families. I think if there are currently or if there are in the future ways to better connect those, that's always helpful. We rely on Guidebook heavily for sort of our source of information and our weekend of management and kind of one-off pieces like that. Is there a world where that is able to better connect to our family portal and event registration is just managed all in one place? Another example is we're working now with our folks who manage our university calendar to kind of integrate what is on Guidebook into that piece. So that came from a group of folks who said, hey, I think a lot of people are confused about where to find the most accurate information for Welcome Week. That's a big week on campus, not just for our office, not just for our team, but for anyone around that entire first week leading up to classes. It is just an event heavy, very, very packed days of events. And so the ask was, is there a way to connect what you all are inputting on Guidebook and what we are used to inputting on the university calendar and make those kind of talk to each other? And so that's a conversation we're having. And I'm excited to see kind of where that goes. But I think that general idea of working smarter, not harder is, I think, what they said. Finding ways to do that would be my kind of next step for Guidebook.
Amazing. I think that's definitely, I know we've spoke a little bit in the build up to this about conversations we're going to have in the next couple of weeks about including some of those integrations and how best to utilize the platform. And I think for anyone, not just utilizing Guidebook, but technology generally, I think it's always good when you should bring those ideas to the account executives or to the people that manage your account for those technology providers to help those product teams along or to ensure that you're maximizing the way in which you use technology. I think that's really good. And I know that just in the preparation for today, some of the conversations we've uncovered a couple of quick wins that we're going to enjoy over the next couple of weeks, which would be great. And I always think, I guess in my mind, it might feel obvious and to others, it might feel obvious too, depending, but I always like to, end the conversation with, what is the feature within Guidebook that has proven to be the most valuable and why for you?
Yeah, I mean, truly several pieces come to mind. I'm just going to say them all. I think being able to open up a map on Guidebook and say, hey, this is exactly where you need to go for this event. Click this and you will be in the right spot has been huge, just based on, navigational challenges, again, of folks who are maybe on campus for the first time. I think that's a driving force in encouraging them to actually use that app. And then again, this one might seem obvious too, but I think just the ability to craft an entire schedule that is then editable all the time is really, that's probably 90% of it for us. I think being able to put as much detail as we want, being able to include resources that we know families are going to ask for later. And then also being able to code those in the way that we are, this is where this is happening. This is who it's, this is the cost of that event, if that's applicable. I think to be able to have that information all visually represented in the way that it is, but also have the flexibility to change that at any point, and have that still looked really polished is by far kind of our biggest win from Guidebook.
Amazing. So I'm just going to see if there are any questions. We don't have. I see one about the app. Apologies for that. We will be sharing obviously this recording with everyone as well as the demo itself, and you can follow up with any questions on the demo if you have them. But does anyone have any final questions today before we close out this webinar for Casey or myself?
Hey, one last thing, if you don't mind, Nathan. I meant to mention this earlier, but when the way that we do it, when we have folks arrive at check-in for any events that I've talked through, one of the ways we encourage that app, I know I talked about videos that we have playing and messages that we send out ahead of time, which we'll continue to do, but it's also on the back of their little badge that they get. And so this is a family weekend one, but we use these for all events. And so typically we just put that QR code. It's blurring out a little bit, but put the QR code on the back of that badge. And so our staff or our students who are managing that process can kind of have their quick spiel ready, like, hey, if you scan this QR code real quick, that's going to take you to the CU Events app. They, in a pretty concise manner, talk through why that's important, what that's going to get them. And they're really not being handed anything else at that point. So I think for folks who are looking for, again, a schedule of resources, any of those pieces, being able to direct them to the CU Events app in that direct conversation is helpful for us.
Amazing. And we've had one question here around for your welcome week. How many admins do you actually have on the back end?
Yep. So we do extend that to at least a couple of our welcome week exec members, so student leaders who help to put on that weekend. So between that group and our professional staff, for us, that's usually probably 5 or 6 people. It is typically, I would say, one of the 3 of us professional staff members who are making those edits, but we do extend that ability to a couple of those students as well, so that they can make those changes too.
And had issues with the maps never loading for locations when inputting them into the schedules. This might be more of a question for me that I can take up. Jacqueline, I will email you afterwards to look at that specific case so I can dig into which app that was for. But Casey, I don't know if you had any specific tips for utilizing maps just generally, because I think
absolutely. Yeah. And Nathan will definitely be the expert on kind of how to make the most sense within that app. I will say for us, we realized a couple of years ago that we were not taking full advantage of the actual, Google Map pin locations. And so we had addresses listed in there. We had campus locations tied to events, but they weren't, for someone who doesn't know campus, those weren't proving as helpful as they could. And so I remember a very specific session a couple of summers ago where we realized that and then went through and, dropped the pin to the exact location for each of those. So you may already be doing that and perhaps it's an issue beyond that. But if not, that I would recommend that version of locations as well.
We have a question here from Taylor. During your initial implementation of new features or aspects of the app and event guide, what are some of the things that proved to be challenging to implement for your university, either by way of technical challenges or on the app side or in the buy-in side from your campus community? It's a great question.
Absolutely. So I will say that process did happen pre-Casey. And so I don't know that I have, the full scope of kind of what that implementation looked like. But from what I understand from previous supervisors, folks who were a part of that process, I don't think buy-in was much of a challenge. I think that, there was certainly just the matter of getting it implemented and getting Guidebook sort of established as that primary tool for our university. But I think a lot of folks outside of our division, within our division, were, from what I understand anyway, on the same page in terms of the way that the pros would outweigh the cons. Certainly not meant to replace any sort of tool or publication for every single event on campus. I don't think it's been this complete overhaul, but I think for the ways that we were using it and for the needs that we had. I think folks who are a part of that process, as they are for any new tool implementation process, they understood that need, and so that went fairly smoothly for us. Happy to follow up with more folks if you've got specifics there.
Amazing. I see Kirsten's, we've got a raised hand. So I'm just going to allow to talk here. Hi, Kirsten. Or did you mean maybe did you mean to raise your hand, Kirsten? Why would just you're on mute, Kirsten, just in case. Or did you not mean to raise your hand? If not, that's fine. We have a question from Liz. Are there any plans in the future to provide ways to incorporate embeddable videos or hosted videos on app pages? Yeah, it's a question for myself. Yeah. So again, with that, I think Liz, I can follow up and share some information around that post event. I'm going to focus on a couple of questions here. Any tips for first year rollout with students for Welcome Week?
Yeah, I think we really rely on our student leaders when it comes to our Welcome Week programming specifically, just because that's such a large group of students, as I'm sure a lot of you kind of do on your campus or will be familiar with. Our Welcome Week programming, for the most part, pretty social based. There are a few pieces of that that are there are a few pieces of that that are required, for lack of a better way to say it. So our new student convocation, we have a something called our Clemson Leader Day, which is a leadership sort of intro training, if you will, that's a part of Welcome Week. A lot of those other pieces, though, are based on social events happening in the evenings, or campus guided tours, or ways to acclimate to campus, all things that are on y'all's schedules as well, I'm sure. But because it is so many students, and because we are trying to provide a quality experience to so many people, we really rely on our Welcome Week leaders who are leading those students in small groups to make sure that key communication is getting out. And so, of course, we send emails and we send messaging that has the guidebook information in it. But we also, and I would say this is true for our new students during the summer as well at orientation sessions, we really do rely on those small group, communications and meetings with our current student leaders so that they can be kind of the face of that message, and they can be the ones, sitting across from them with their phone, showing them the app, walking them through the importance of downloading it, walking them through the reasons it'll be helpful within that next 4 or 5 days. And so I think with any new app or anything that students would not have a reason to have prior to coming to campus, there's a challenge there, and there is a sort of process of getting students to buy in. But I think if you can set up current student leaders to be sort of the amplifiers of that message and kind of the examples, that tends to pull a little bit more weight than maybe me saying it to a group of incoming students, for example.
Absolutely. And we've got one final question here before we wrap up for today. If you have a main guide out of your different guides throughout the year, do you import your full university events calendar into that guide, or only specific categories of events, or do you manually add specific featured events as you go?
So we don't have a main guide. There's not something for us in Guidebook that is sort of this sole source of every event ever, especially because, again, not every single event is managed by the C Events app or by Guidebook. For us, we tend to have a Welcome Week guide that we update, a family weekend guide that we update for both fall and spring, and then our what we call Ready, Set, Roar is our in-person orientation experience guide. Those are the ones that we kind of regularly update, and we have a couple different ways of managing the events that go in those. I will say the comment I made earlier about the university calendar is something that we're working on to basically feed what's in our guidebook, our Welcome Week guide, to the university calendar. So the idea being that if a student sees either of those platforms, they're seeing the same information, and if it's updated in one place, it's updated in both. We did just start that process a couple of weeks ago, so I don't have the best sense of kind of what that will look like just yet, but we're working with folks on the kind of the university marketing team who manage that calendar to make that process happen. So that may be an opportunity for you on your campus as well.
Amazing. And with that, Casey, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing a lot of your wisdom and insight. I really appreciate you, participating. This is, as I mentioned at the top, this is the first in a new series. We're hoping to do this on a monthly basis, where we can really, we want to kind of hear from as many campuses and universities as we can. I think it's really interesting to see how different people are utilizing the app and really thinking about the events that they run. So thank you very much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the conversation. It was great.
Lovely. And also thank you to Rick and his team for the sign language interpretation today. And yeah, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.